philology, specializing in the literary history of the late medieval and early modern periods, in particular the 16th century CE. He was formerly of the Freie Universität Berlin as a postdoctoral fellow, exploring both Persian and Arabic sources and beyond, relating to the Kalila and Dimna tradition. He completed his PhD in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago, studying classical Persian literature as well as Iranian and Central Asian history. His dissertation, The Lives of Sam Mirza, Dynastic Strife and Literary World Building in Early Safavid Iran, is built around the career of a 16th century prince who managed to author a valuable biographical anthology of poets before being in prison, executed for the order of his brother. Dr. Beers' articles have been published in the Journal of Persianate Studies, Al-Usura al-Wusta, and Philological Encounters. So this talk today will be about the Kalila and Dimna, the world-famous book of animal and human fables, which has enjoyed a pretty prolific translation history. I mean, Theo and I were just talking earlier about the editions that we're familiar with. A lot of people are familiar with the Arabic and Persian editions. I'm familiar with a Malay adaptation from the 18th and 19th centuries, translated from various South Asian sources. So it's got a career in the Indian Ocean as well. Classical Persian, of course, features numerous adaptations of this text from various patronage contexts and in various literary forms, prose, verse, either embellished or in a more spare style. And while some are famous and well-studied, others remain largely unknown. And one of them being a version by Ahmed bin Mahmud Qani Tusi from the 13th century, which Dr. Beers will be sharing with us about today. So wonderful.
So hopefully those following on Zoom can hear me, and those here can probably hear me, I would guess. I'm just gonna, let me see, how am I gonna have this? There we go. Yes, so just to get an outline of what I'll be talking about, and I'll try to keep this efficient. I'll be speaking about a certain very little known, little studied version of the Fables of Kalila and Dimna, written in poetry, in Persian poetry, by a poet at the Seljuk court, the Seljuks of Rum, the Anatolian Seljuk Sultanate, around the year 1260 CE. We don't know exactly, but that's our best estimate based on clues in the text. Not only do we not know exactly when Qani composed this long poetry version of Kalila and Dimna, but we don't know, because he doesn't say exactly what his sources were, what prose version of Kalila and Dimna was, if it served as his basis for the versification. It has, however, long been assumed, and it is very logical to assume that his source was the 12th century Persian prose Kalila and Dimna by Nasrullah Munshi, which had been written at the Ghaznavid court in around the 1140s CE. So my question, rather simple question for this presentation is, can we somehow document more specifically, more securely, that it was in fact Nasrullah Munshi's Kalila and Dimna that was used as the basis of Qani Tusi's versification? And the answer is yes, I think beyond a shadow of a doubt. And the way that I'll demonstrate that is by showing some highly distinctive passages that were added by Nasrullah Munshi to Kalila and Dimna in his 12th century version that he had translated based on the Arabic. And he added a huge amount and variety of things to the Book of Fables in the process of making his translation. And many of these very distinctive passages that just don't show up at all in the Arabic Kalila and Dimna are then carried through into the versification of Qani Tusi, sometimes in very interesting ways. And for me, the sort of generally, why does this matter, or how could it possibly be interesting question, could be answered by, we can, among other things, look at the career of Qani Tusi as an example of the movement of Persianate Iranian scholars, intellectuals, and authors westward during the time of the Mongol conquests. And these figures went from, let's say, the Ghaznavid realm, the Khwarazm Shahi realm, whatever we want to call it, west into, for instance, Seljuk Anatolia, and had to make careers for themselves and find patronage and find texts that they could translate or adapt, or in this case, versify. And so this production of a new poetry version of Kalila and Dimna is a good example of that process, which has been discussed by scholars in our field in many other contexts, like, Frank Griffel writing about the formation of poets' classical philosophy, talks about other figures who were philosophers who made the similar kind of east to west movement in this period and the influence that that had. Okay. I'm sure probably almost everyone here has at least a base level of familiarity with Kalila and Demna, maybe, but just to one moment, like it's a book of fables, mostly animal fables, but also human related fables. In fact, some of the chapters don't have, well, I think they all have at least an animal character. Don't quote me on that, but there are chapters whose main characters are humans, and there are chapters all of whose characters are animals. But in any case, it's ultimately of ancient Sanskrit origin. I'll talk a little bit about this on the next slide as well. But it's a book of stories that have ethical and political lessons. Things like what are the consequences of betrayal, the dangers of acting in haste, what are the benefits of true friendship, all kinds of things like that. And it reaches escape velocity and takes on a status as one of the most widely successful works of pre-modern world literature. I think we can say anywhere in any language. And in fact, it's translated into dozens of languages. You would have a hard time finding any language of the old world, let's say, that didn't at some point find adaptation, a translation of Kalila and Demna into it. And it's a major work of court literature. It's the kind of book that you can present to a prince or a ruler and say, here's a fine illustrated manuscript of this book of animal fables that you can use to learn lessons on how to be a more effective politician, ruler, whatever. Yes, and within this complicated matrix of how Kalila and Demna grows, it can be said probably that the Arabic version that appeared in the mid-8th century CE at the hands of Ibn Muqaffa, translated from Middle Persian, is probably the single most important node, most important moment in the history of this text, because almost all subsequent versions over a period of a millennium in many, many languages can ultimately be traced to the Arabic, with the single exception of one of the Syriac versions that was translated directly from Middle Persian. But other than that, it all ultimately goes back to the Arabic. Yeah, and there's, as Faris already said by way of introducing the talk, there are all different kinds of versions of Kalila and Demna in different languages. We have some in poetry, some in prose. There's an Arabic verse, Kalila and Demna, from around the turn of the 6th, 12th century by Ibn al-Habbari. It's not even the only Arabic versification, just the best known among them. There's a Persian versification already in the early 10th century in the Salmonid period by Rubaki, bits of which are still extant. In the 12th century, there's 2 Persian prose translations based on the Arabic, one of them barely known at all. It's made in Zangid, Mosul, dedicated to one of the Atabeks there, in a work that only survives in a single manuscript. The other, and the one that I'm going to show becomes the source for Qani Tusi's versification, is the Persian prose Kalila and Demna by Nasrullah Munshi, written at the Ghaznavid court under the ruler Bahram Shah in about the 1140s CE, about 540 Hijri. Yeah, so this is just a brief timeline. I'll probably mostly skip over this slide because I don't want to lose too much more time, but I think it's worth understanding how Kalila and Demna, in addition to being a very famous, obviously, work and textual tradition that everyone has at least some basic level of familiarity with, is also severely problematic, including in the Arabic. And that is due in no small part to the fact that we have a 5-century gap between when we think the Arabic Kalila and Demna was authored and when the first datable, complete or even somewhat complete manuscripts of the work start to appear. This is the colophon of the oldest Arabic manuscript of Kalila and Demna, and it's dated, 618, 1221. It's the first day of what? Jumada al-Akhir in 618. So that's, late July, 1221, which is not super early by other standards. It's, just barely maybe pre-Mongol, but that's the best that we have. And then if you think about how messy this is, during those almost 500 years between the authorship of Kalila and Demna in Arabic and the first manuscripts that we have, the text came into many different versions, widely varying manuscript tradition, translated into several other languages, not just Persian, but also Hebrew and Greek, and it starts to branch out into this unbelievably complex, multilingual cross-regional textual tradition during a time when the evolution of the Arabic text is still obscured for us because we can't see manuscripts from that period. We just know that it's ballooning out during this whole time. So with that, I want to come to Hani Tusi and just talk a little bit about who this guy is in mid-13th century Anatolia. His full name is, well, he comes to be known as Malik al-Shu'ara, king of the poets, Amir Bahauddin Ahmad ibn Mahmud Hani Tusi, Hani being his tafannus or his poetic pen name. He's born, we guess, in the late 6th, 12th century, in or around Tus and Khorasan, the same place that the poet Ferdowsi, author of the Shahnameh, is from. Like so many others around the time of the Mongol invasion, he flees from Khorasan and goes all over the place. First, he goes to India, then he crosses over to Aden, and then he goes to Sana'a, and then he goes to the Hijaz, and then makes the Hajj, and then finally works his way up into Baghdad, and then finally makes it into Anatolia, where he settles for the rest of his life to serve the Seljuk Sultans as a poet. And we only know any of this because his verse, Kalila-i-Demna, has an appendix section where he talks about his own biography. Well, sorry, we know a little bit more about him from another source that I think Antonio will find interesting. But most of what we know about his own life comes from his verse, Kalila-i-Demna. So he serves a number of Seljuk Sultans, Kay-Qubad, Kay-Khosrow, Kay-Kos. He claims to have composed about 300,000 lines of poetry in the service of the Seljuks, most of which didn't survive. We know that he wrote a large Seljuk Nome, like a verse history of the Seljuk dynasty, which is mostly lost, except that parts of it have survived in another Seljuk history. I don't know if anyone here knows anything about the Seljuk chronicle tradition. Just in case, parts of Hani's Seljuk Nome do survive in a way. And his only actual surviving whole work is this versified Kalila-i-Demna, which in itself is about 10,000 lines of poetry. And this is where I thought Antonio would find this interesting, that Hani also, he becomes a Mevlev disciple. And we know that Hani lived until at least 672 Hijri, 1273 Common Era, because he's present at this celebration of the life of Jalaluddin Rumi that's thrown by his disciples just after he passes, and Hani supposedly recites a ruba'i on the occasion. And for this and for his affiliation with the Mevlevis, he gets an entry or gets some discussion in Aflaki's Manaqib al-Arifin. So yeah, he's a real person. We know a few things about him. And the dating of the Kalila-i-Demna is just on the thin basis that he says at the time that he wrote this, he had been about 40 years at the Seljuk court. So that's it. Okay, and yeah, this is a title page of that other Seljuk chronicle that I mentioned, Ibn Bibi's Awamir al-Ala'iyya fil Umur al-Ala'iyya, parts of which are known to have been based. Zabihullah Safa was able to demonstrate that parts of this were based on Qani's Seljuk Nome. Fine. Okay, so what about Qani's Kalila-i-Demna? I mentioned the dating already. It's dedicated to Kay-Kos, one of the at least three Seljuk sultans that he served. 10,000 lines in the Mutaqarrib meter, which is the meter of the Shahnameh. This file is also unmistakably imitative of the Shahnameh, which one of the commentators on this work, Mr. Malek of the eponymous of the Malek Library of Manuscripts, wrote a note in the margins of one of the manuscripts of this Kalila-i-Demna versification. And he said, like, the easiest way to make a fool of yourself in Persian poetry, I'm paraphrasing, but the easiest way to come up looking really dumb is to try to write an imitation of the Shahnameh. And no one who has ever tried it, with the partial exception maybe of Hatifi, no one who's ever tried to do it has come out looking good. And so yeah, stylistically, it's not viewed as wonderful poetry. And we now know that there are at least 4 extant manuscripts of this versification, thanks to recent work by Yui Kanda, who I hope will publish some of her findings on this. We have, there's a British Library manuscript that's been known about for quite a while. It's deficient. There's the Malik Library manuscript in Iran, also deficient. Those 2 manuscripts were the basis of a printed edition done by a Georgian scholar named Magali Todua in the late 70s. And now we have 2 more manuscripts that we know of. One of them is illustrated. It's in Mumbai at the Shivaji Maharaj Museum, formerly the Prince of Wales Museum. That's an illustrated manuscript dated roughly to late Timurid period, or maybe late Delhi Sultan period. I don't know what we want to call it. And then the one that Yui Kanda has just discovered is a manuscript at the Rylands Library at the University of Manchester, which was mistakenly, not exactly mistakenly cataloged, but it was cataloged as a version of Kalila and Dimna without specifying that in fact it's the verse version of Poni Tusi. And she was somehow the first person who noticed this. That's a late manuscript, early 19th century, but still, it's now very much a desideratum that someone could go back maybe and re-edit this text. Not that it's a famous work, and not that it will be easy. And I don't know if anyone will do it. And if anyone does, it's more likely to be an Iranian scholar. They just produce a lot more critical or scholarly editions. But hopefully someone will. Right. And we have this assumption, and this is just a little sample of the Malek Library manuscript, which was the primary basis on which Margali Todua did his edition. Right. And so we have this long-running assumption, like I said, that Poni must have based this versification on the prose version from about a century, 130 years earlier, let's say 120 years earlier, by Nasrullah Munshi. Why do we think this? So he says that he's versifying a text in prose. He thinks he's the first person in Persian poetry to compose a versified Kalila and Dimna. We know that's not the case, that Rudaki had done so, a few hundred years earlier. But it's likely that they didn't really have access at this time to Rudaki's Kalila and Dimna in any kind of coherent form. Meanwhile, at this time, Nasrullah Munshi's version of the Book of Fables is extremely famous. We know it's being widely copied. There are even kind of linguistic glosses of the text that are being produced to help people understand Nasrullah's many difficult quotes of Arabic poetry that he inserted into the Fables. And so we know it's very, very easy to imagine that Poni would definitely have had access to Nasrullah's version. And meanwhile, the only other Persian prose version at this time that was around, maybe, was that one by Bukhari that I mentioned that was done in Mosul. But that only exists in a single manuscript, and we don't have any real reason to suspect that Poni would have had access to it or known about it. So just by far the very obvious choice is, okay, of course, at this time in the 13th century, if you write a Persian verse, Kalila and Dimna, if you're not going directly from the Arabic, then the version that you would be using would be Nasrullah Munshi's version. So it's kind of circumstantial. And this is how Todua mentions it in the introduction to his edition of the text. He just comes out and says it. He says, okay, fine. So he translated it into Persian verse. Whatever, but unfortunately, Todua never really goes into detail on what he means about this or why. How can we tell? Because as I said, Poni, he doesn't mention what his sources are. Okay, right, doesn't mention sources, and some of the most obvious aspects of Nasrullah's text are not applicable here, just by the nature of how things are. Nasrullah has his own preface to the Kalila and Dimna that he added, which Poni doesn't really use or doesn't use in any form that's immediately recognizable. Nasrullah also, in his version of Kalila and Dimna, packed the text with quotes from Quranic verses, hadith, lines of Arabic and Persian poetry, wisdom sayings, and stuff that just by the nature of creating a Persian verse version, it can't really be folded in the same way. Because Poni had to turn it into Persian verse in the Mutaqarrib meter, like all the quotes are kind of out the window, However, we can say at least that the chapter order followed by Poni is similar to that of Nasrullah's text, but that's not exactly a unique chapter order. Anyway, I figure instead, let's cut to the chase. Let's look directly at the text. Let's try to find some very distinctive things in Nasrullah's version and just see if we can find them also coming up in Poni's. So that's what I want to do. I've got 3 examples. I know I'm taking way too long. I'll try and speed it up. So the first example that I want to share is from the fable of the ascetic and the weasel. And this is a story on the danger of acting in haste and why you shouldn't act hastily. And it's the story of this older ascetic and his wife who've been praying for a long time to have a child. And finally they have a son. They're blessed with a kid. And at some point, someday, the wife has to go out to run some errands of her own, and the husband, the ascetic, has to go out to do his business. And they don't have a babysitter except for this weasel that lives with them in the house. And while they're gone, a snake enters the house and is going to go in the crib and attack the child. And the weasel, the faithful weasel pet, kills the snake, protecting the child. The ascetic comes back, he sees the blood and sees the weasel has blood on its snout and immediately beats the weasel to death. And then realizes when he goes in that he's made this awful mistake. Yes, so just to give a flavor of what the fables are like, and this is from a British Library manuscript of the Arabic, where you see him kind of spearing the weasel or whatever. So in Nasrullah's version, and it's very strange, I don't know why he made this connection in the introductory dialogue of the chapter where the king, well, I should mention that every chapter of Timurid-Turkmen starts with, there's this framing conceit where all of the fables are told by a philosopher, or in some versions, a Brahmin, told to a king who, at the beginning of every chapter, requests the next story and says what he wants to hear about. And then the philosopher narrator says, oh, I'm going to tell you the such and such story. And in Nasrullah's version, he inserts this whole extra dialogue here about how important it is to show the virtue of clemency, or in Arabic and Persian, hilm. And then he also mentions how among the prophets, the one who was most noted for his clemency was Abraham, or al-Khalid. And no, just Khalid, I guess. Yeah, so there's this very peculiar, and just to give you a sense of how this goes from the Arabic into the Persian, this is what the Arabic introduction of this chapter looks like. And this is actually from Michael Fishbein's Library of Literature edition of Khalid and Dimna that he and James Montgomery co-translated. So it's very brief. King just says, I heard your last story, now give me the next one on acting in haste. And then the philosopher says, yeah, you need to act in haste. And to tell you this, I'm going to tell you the story of the holy man who killed the innocent mongoose. So it's a mongoose and some baroons, a weasel and others. Okay, very basic. Now, the equivalent thing in Nasrullah Munchi's version, this first paragraph basically is the king requesting the story. And then at the very end, we see Brahman Guft. It's a Brahmin in this version. And the Brahmin just immediately quotes a line of classical Arabic poetry. And then he starts talking about the importance of acting in a stable manner. And then he gets into this whole thing about how the most praiseworthy virtue that a ruler could have is hilm, is clemency, and vaqar has a similar meaning. And then you can see here already he's quoting what he identifies as a hadith from the prophets. And it goes on. And here's the same thing from a manuscript. Starts talking about the importance of clemency, quotes a hadith, quotes a Quranic verse, and then finally gets to this point about how dar sifat Khalil alayhi salam miyayad inna Ibrahim la'awwahun halim. So there's this, I don't know if it's a Quranic verse or a saying about Abraham, that he was pious and clement, he was merciful. Okay, fine. I know that's a lot of preliminary, but if we go to the equivalent passage in Panian Tusi's versification, we see this same very strange, in context of Khalid and Dimna, move toward, we're not just talking about the importance of not acting in haste, but also clemency is a really important virtue, and Abraham was distinguished for his clemency. You know, it kind of comes out of nowhere. So he says, Magar hel mubidari o magz o sang ke az qa'ir darya bararad nahang. So it's talking about clemency and awareness and sort of heaviness of disposition. This is what will allow for the crocodile to be pulled out of the depths of the sea. And then gets down here to where he says, Barahim dar helm bod bi adil bedon khond izad mamra khalil. So Abraham was in clemency without equal, and it was for this reason that God called him Khalil. Okay, so I think hopefully you can see kind of what I'm getting at with pulling out these sort of strange moves in the text. Now, the next one is much stranger. I might just do two.
We have more. I mean, you can go up to like 130.
Well, I don't want to, I mean, I know Abigail has to leave.
Oh,
it's fine. We can, I think you'll get the point at a certain point. I mean, this is among all the examples I have really the craziest of them. This is from the fable of the king and the bird. The message of which is that sometimes a relationship is irreparably broken, and you have to recognize that and walk away from it. You have to go no contact. And they tell this, there's a story of a king who has this bird that's like his best friend, and the bird gets in a fight with the king's son, the prince, and blinds the prince. And then the king is like, you know what? As bad as this was, it's okay. Come back. We can be friends again. And the bird is like, no. Like, it's not going to happen. Our relationship is broken. I have to go, pretty much. And then just kind of like this almost meditation on how fate has at a certain point decreed that things have to go a certain way. You can't really struggle against that. In this one, very, very, very unusually, Nasrullah has added actually a whole sub-story into the middle of the fable. So sometimes in Qalil and Dimna, there's the frame fable, and then characters within these fables will narrate their own sub-stories. And for the most part, it's a little bit unusual for a whole new sub-story to be added in. It's not without precedent. I mean, some versions of Qalil and Dimna will do this. But this is a very odd one where Nasrullah has added this extra story, and it's told by the bird character. And it's a story about a woman who, an old woman who has a beautiful daughter, and as much as the old woman loves her daughter, she just betrays her in a moment of fear. How, loving someone, I guess, isn't enough to overcome like very difficult circumstances, I guess. And the new sub-story is added in verse, so it's in poetry. And if you look at it, and I didn't realize this when I first saw it, but I later realized, thanks to a colleague who pointed out to me, that this poetry that Nasrullah uses here for this story is actually taken entirely from Sana'i Ghaznavi's Hadithat al-Haqiqah, which is this mystical book of poetry from just a little, also from the Ghaznavid period, from just a little bit before the time of Nasrullah. And he actually quotes a lot of poetry from Sana'i throughout his version of Qalil and Dimna. But this whole story that he's added is in poetry, and it comes straight from Sana'i. And I'll show that here. I'll just read a few lines. This is in the Khafif meter. So dasht zali berustay Chakov, mahsati nom dokhtari segov, no arusi chusar tar balan, chusar no balan, gasht ruzi bar cheshme bad nalan. Yeah, so an old woman living in the village of Chakov or Jakar or whatever has a daughter named Mahsati and also 3 cows that they keep with them. And the daughter was like a beautiful, bride, tall, had like the stature of a cypress tree. But one day the daughter gets sick for whatever reason because of the evil eye, the Chishmabad. And I don't want to read the whole poem, but basically the daughter gets sick, and then one of the cows that live in this property gets its head stuck in like a jar of food and starts rampaging around the property and goes in the house. And the old woman is so terrified, she thinks it's the angel of death that's come to take her daughter away. And she says, "Oh, angel of death, don't take me. I'm just some poor old woman. Just take my daughter instead. Like, she's the one you want." So as much as she loves her daughter, she's an unbelievable act of betrayal at the moment when this cow with its head stuck in a jar rampages into the house. She says at the end, "Hey Melek emot man namahsatiyam man yeki pirzal mihnatiyam." So, oh angel of death, I'm not mahsati. I'm not the maiden that you're after. I'm just a poor old woman. Fine. And like I said, this comes straight from Sana'i's Haditha, which is cool in itself that Nasrullah does this. And here we find the same story in Qani Tusi's version, where he says, "Shenidi kedar rustay takav zani dashti dokhtayu dogav." So here's only 2 cows. The number of cows has been reduced, but the story otherwise is the same. And yeah, at the end, زن پنداشت کو مالک است که گاه اجل زخم او حالک است، همان گه که چشمش مرو را بدید بدین گونه با او فغان در کشید که من پیر معاجزم و کور و کر، چه خواهی ز من دخترم را ببر. So she says, as soon as she saw this rampaging cow, she shouted, "I'm old and weak and deaf and blind. What do you want from me? Take my daughter instead." And this ends up being one of these weird. It's hard to think of other examples of Persian poetry being transmuted into Persian poetry in a different meter at a later time. It's kind of this strange sort of. I wonder if Qani realized what he was doing. He was writing like a mutaqarribification of the Haditha of Sana'i. Maybe he did. Okay, whoops. Sorry about that.
Can you confuse the system?
Yeah, speaking for it's like I think
Oh,
transcribe
it got me speaking Persian.
Yeah.
So yes, basically, this is an even stranger, even more distinctive case where there's just no way. I mean, obviously he got this from Nasrullah's version that has this specific passage from Sanai's Hadith put in this specific moment in the Fable of the King and the Bird. Now, I think I'm going to skip example 3. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just give you the very, very brief version. This is the chapter of the ascetic and the guest. It's another very funny story. There's an ascetic who's renowned for his piety and sort of renunciation, and he has a guest come visit him. And the guest is so enamored of the Hebrew that the ascetic speaks that he begs to be taught the language. And the ascetic is like, no, you're making a mistake. Not only will you not learn good Hebrew from me, but you'll forget your own language. And then he tells a funny story of like a crow that wanted to learn to walk like a partridge, and the yams just look like a foolish, staggering bird. And there's such a weird passage that Nasrullah adds near the beginning of this, and the introduction of it in Arabic, again, very basic, very straightforward. Doesn't take too long to get to the point where the ascetic. Well, actually, this is a little weird too. The ascetic gives the guests some dates, and they have this whole conversation about whether dates are healthy food or not. Instead of that, in Nasrullah's version, the guest shows up, the ascetic gives him some food, and the ascetic asks, like, where are you from and where are you headed? And the guest gives this crazy reply. He says, "Bar hal ashiqan sadiq be sam'a zahir bi iyan batin wuquf natawan yafت." So one cannot understand the condition of true lovers by listening only to the outward, without seeing what lies beneath, or the batin. And then he says that if someone with like an overly intellectual perspective goes out on the path of love, and seeks to please the beloved, he will definitely get lost in the valley of separation. Until he turns his gaze toward the qibla of the heart. And so this really, really strange, out of nowhere Sufi passage. And actually, when Wheeler Thaxton was translating Nasrullah Munshi's Qayyid and Dimna into English, he found this passage so weird that he cut it out of the text and then replaced it with some material from a different version of Qayyid. He's like, the text here is obviously heavily corrupted. But Qani E2C evidently didn't think so, because he has the same kind of thing. He has the ascetic asking him, "Beporsi dazun kas kuja amadi ke bada zato baste dast bedi," blah blah blah. Where are you from? Where are you headed? And then we get a similar kind of Sufi inflected reply. Musafir javabesh bin budad. I don't want to get into that. Kevakif tawan that shuran hich kas kazisins sukhan bar nayad nefas. That no one can understand this. No one can speak of this thing. And then he says, my place and my destination are on the path to him or her. And anyone who has two beloveds has no heart at all. And it goes on and on. But you can see it's the same really weird, where are you from and where are you going? Oh, I'm on the path of the heart passage. Fine. Conclusions. Yes. Definitely, Qani E2C was using Nasrullah Munshi's version. And we can say that now with better than circumstantial evidence. We have these very idiosyncratic, these very strange, I should say, passages that come up in Nasrullah's version that just are not there at all in the Arabic. And we pretty reliably can also find them echoed more or less directly, more or less obviously in Qani's text. Now, this doesn't mean that Qani had no sources other than Nasrullah. Okay, that's a whole other can of worms. There is some material in the appendix in the Zay of Qani's poem that cannot easily be traced actually to Nasrullah's version. And so that's a real problem. But overwhelmingly, the overwhelming majority of this, I think, is basically a versification of Nasrullah Munshi's prose version. I think you can really show it on textual grounds. It's not far-fetched. Yeah, and like I mentioned at the beginning, we can look at this in terms of the movement of people, texts, ideas from Khorasan to the west of the west of the Mashriq, I guess we can say, around the time of the Mamluk conquests. And this is not even the only translation or adaptation of Nasrullah Mochi's Kalila and Dim that we have from this period. Another Iranian scholar, author of this time, actually retranslates Nasrullah's Persian Kalila and Dim back into Arabic. And one of my colleagues in Berlin and I co-authored an article on that. And that author, again, tried to obscure the source that he was using for his translation. So there even seems to be this idea or this feeling among these authors who are moving west and trying to find new patronage that they want, if anything, to emphasize the originality of the work that they're producing. They don't want it to be too obvious that what they're really doing is bringing to a new audience this already very famous Persian Kalila from the Ghaznavid period. Okay, and just a list of a few references. But with that, I thank you for your attention. And yeah, that's it.
So thank you, Theo. For the time that we have, open the floor to those participating via Zoom can also put your questions through the chat, and I'll post them too.
Yeah, and I killed the slides, but if any question references any specific thing, I can reach out the screen, so you don't have to worry about that.
So feel free, anyone.
Thank you, Theo, for this interesting talk. I was curious in more the, I guess, broader context of the Kalila Dimna textual tradition. In looking at these different adaptations, translations, and so on, is there any discernible sort of factors that would lead to the inclusion of, say, more material from the Quran or the past different poetic traditions and so on? Just curious about the reasons or factors for including different material based on political context, social context, religious context.
Yeah, I mean, Nasrullah Munshi, hopefully everyone can still hear me. He's very clear in his own preface about what he's trying to do, where he has this whole interpretive program of Kalila and Dimna. His idea is that after the Quran, after scripture, the best book you could put in the hands of anyone, especially a ruler, but anyone, in order to instruct them ethically, is the book of Fables of Kalila and Dimna. And he says that no other book in history has moved from ummah to ummah, from millah to millah, and it's never been rejected. That this is the one that every community takes in Kalila Dimna and finds something new from it. And for him, he's also trying to glorify the Ghaznavid Sultanate that he's serving. And so he talks at length in his preface about how the Ghaznavids had served as Ghuzats. They had expanded the Dawla Islam. They brought tons of new people into the fold, and how for this kind of world historically important dynasty, it was like an auspicious moment to create a new, more, let's say, Islamically oriented version of Kalila Dimna. Like it's a good and relevant thing for him. And he says, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to adorn these fables with quotes from the Quran, from Hadith, and then he also adds a lot of Arabic and Persian poetry. And of course, I think he's also showing off for patronage, right? I mean, he works as a court secretary to the Ghaznavids, and so he can show them, like, I'm the best. I know all the poetry. I know all the Islamic sciences. But there's also like an interpretive program there. And that's not the case of every version of Kalila Dimna. Some of them arise in contexts where all the person had to do was translate the fable book into a new language, right? And that's already like a great contribution in a way. But it's a little different in Ghaznavid 12th century, where people who were well-read at that time, literate members of the literate scholarly class or whatever, would have easily also had access to the Arabic Kalila Dimna. They could read it in Arabic. So if you're going to go to the effort of translating it into Persian, maybe it's not a bad idea to also kind of do something original and dress it up a little bit. So yeah, there's like a lot of reasons actually why something like that could happen. Yeah. Thank you. That was a good question.
Yeah.
Thank you. So two quick questions. The first one is about the reception and the audience of this very specific volume.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about how this book was received? It was just one of many produced in a similar way for the court. And whatever you can say about that. And the other one, I don't know what it will mean, but when you were telling us the first story, the weasel and the snake, that made me think about a similar story that I remember reading in elementary school. And then I Googled it, and we didn't read it as apart from Khalil and Dimma.
Yeah.
We read it as La Fontaine and Masallar.
Okay.
So this was one of the fables from La Fontaine, but
Yeah.
it was the same story.
Yeah.
So what is going on there? Who is actually, maybe the reception and the circulation and attribution is actually much wider.
For sure. For sure. Maybe I can touch the second part first, because yeah, I mean, in the Khalila and Demna, as I mentioned, like by the 11th, 12th century, I won't give exact dates, but we see pretty early on multiple Hebrew translations of it, and then also in Greek. And then in the 13th century, there's a Latin translation. There's more than one Latin translation, but one that I'm thinking of in particular by John of Capua. Also in the 13th century, it's translated into Old Castilian from the Arabic. And so like it starts to enter Europe, right? Also in the Middle Ages. And then by the 15th century, there's like another version in Spanish, and there's a version in German called Das Buch der Alten Weisen, the Book of the Old Wise Men. And so, yeah, and that's not even the only vector into Europe, right? Because also during the Ottoman period, where there had been multiple Ottoman Turkish versions also produced, then there's like the Ottoman vector of literary and cultural influence into Europe. So it's very easy to imagine, right, that then some of these fables could be back reflected into Turkish literature with the idea like, oh, this is something I read in a book of old fables by a European author, you know, like without realizing it's like, 1,000 years old, you know, and like went all the way from Sanskrit through Arabic into multiple European languages and then back or whatever. So that's part of the kind of insanity of Khalila and Demna. As for the reception of Qani's version, we don't know very much about it. You know, we have a few manuscripts. I mean, there's 4 manuscripts. One of them is illustrated, but it's not a work that is very much discussed by later authors. I would have told you until recently we realized that there's 4 manuscripts instead of 2. I would have just told you, oh, there's only a couple of manuscripts. You know, it doesn't seem like it was a very successful text or whatever. Now that, if anything, is being complicated, and clearly there was some real survival of this and copying of it for there to be 4 manuscripts, one of them illustrated, and the most recent of the manuscripts copied in the early 19th century. But I just don't know yet how to go about trying to figure out who was reading it, how many people were reading it, in what contexts. You know, was this one of the versions of Khalila and Demna that was being used in educational contexts? I don't know. We do know that Nasrullah Munshi's version was being used that way. That's part of the reason that there are shul produced for it, to help people who maybe don't have a good command of Arabic to read some of the Arabic poetry quotes. But we don't have any of that easily accessible context for Qani. But I'm really hoping, especially if Yui Kanda writes more about this early 19th century copy. I'm very curious under what circumstances that was produced and where and why and for whom, because I think that could give us a little bit more purchase on this question of, you know, what was the legacy of this work? What was its audience? It's very hard to say otherwise. Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, all right.
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about the difference between prose and verse versions, and you know, in your study, have you seen a sort of pattern that, you know, if it becomes more popular at certain times, or is the Persian or Arabic, different languages of the Persian verse more popular? I was just wondering if you had thoughts on the genre and how it kind of unfolded in this time period.
It's funny because another thing that Nasrullah Munshi says in the preface to his version is that the reason that Rudaki had written a poetry version of Khalila and Demna is that the nature of humans inclines more toward poetry than toward prose. And so he mentions that as the driving force behind why the Salmonids wanted a poetry version of it. And yet all of the most famous versions of Khalila and Demna in really all of the languages are prose ones. It's this funny thing where there's a lot of versifications, or I don't know if we can say a lot, but several, right? There's at least in Persian, there's at least 2 or 3 in Arabic. I don't know if Turkish ever saw a verse version, but it's really the prose versions, for whatever reason, especially those affiliated with or associated with strong court patronage contexts, that really take off and end up having longer afterlives and more influence. And those are the ones that are mostly copied in lavish versions. But yeah, I mean, you could imagine, because the other thing that we know is that there was something of a performance tradition of recitation of these stories, that storytellers would go around and kind of perform them. And one would imagine that, like we see with the Naqali tradition of the Shahnameh, that it would be like it would make a lot of sense to use a poetry Kanidin for that. But we don't have really any indication of that. So that for me, if any, the puzzle in that question is why did the poetry versions not really catch on the way that some of the prose versions did? But I don't know. At least Nasrullah Munshi at least was of the opinion that there was like a value to, even though he wasn't doing it himself, he was producing a prose version that had a lot of poetry quotes in it. His explanation for Rudaki's project was that it should...
And he himself doesn't say why he's doing it?
No, he does. I mean, he says that, yeah. He said that he wanted to, and he credits himself with, like I mentioned, he credits himself with being the first to make a Persian poetry, Kanidin, even though that's not the case. But I'm trying to remember what it is that he says in the appendix about aesthetically what he was trying to do. I can't recall. But yeah, he's purposefully doing this in poetry.
I guess I have a question, and it builds on that actually, because I'm curious about the role of the translators and the performers, because they're so fundamental to this prolific spread of the work. And we know a lot about how the text is regarded as having an ethical effect on the audience or the patron or who's meant to receive the work. But do we have any indication on what was the ethical payoff for the person doing the translation, doing the performing? Because I mean, it's important that he has a whole biographical index in his translation. So I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because the payoff that I'm always focusing on is the patronage, like the literal payoff. I don't know what the ethical payoff. That's a good question. And of course, to have, if someone's written a long masnavi, a long work of narrative poetry in Persian, it's not so unusual for either introductory abwab of that, or for concluding abwab to feature a little bit of, that's where the dedication would go, and it does go. That's where sometimes there's a little bit of autobiographical discussion. So it's conventional enough that he does that. I don't know how much we can read into whether he's like meditating on what he's gained from the process of translating. If anything, he's more focused on what a good poet he is and how greatly he's served the Seljuk court by, like I said, composing. He talks about how many camel loads it took to carry all of his poetry that he had done under the Seljuks. But that's a good question of what could these authors get out of producing these new translations and adaptations of Kanidin Dimna, other than the obvious, which is that it was a really easy way to seek patronage, especially at a new court, at an upstart court, or in a literary tradition that didn't yet have a very well-developed canon. I like to joke that Kanidin Dimna is part of the starter pack of works that when you're getting something going, one of the first things that you would want to do is make a translation of Kanidin Dimna. And one of the first nice books that you would want to commission for the Royal Library, a nice copy of it, maybe with some illustrations. We see that we even see that in Persian. It really does not take that long to start to sponsor Kanidin Dimna versions. It's already happening with the Solmonids. It doesn't take long under when the Ottomans really rise to the absolute heights, in the 16th century. There were earlier Ottoman Turkish versions, so I shouldn't even say that. But in this great period of patronage, during during the reign of Suleiman. There's a translation of yeah, well, it must have been because it would have been in the 1520s or 30s that Vasi Alisi produces his famous Turkish translation of Kalilan based on the Anwar Sohaili. So it's just one of these kind of things where at these crucial junctures where there's like an increase in patronage or new kinds of patronage of literary works. Yeah. It's just curiously common to find someone producing a new version of Kalilan. And so it's very easy to look at that from the mercenary perspective. I don't know though what, yeah, and well, and to give a partial better answer, Nasrullah at least does explain that he has this whole interpretive program for Kalilan, and so one thing that he gains, I guess, is bringing to fruition his idea that this is the single greatest work of practical ethical literature maybe in the world, and that it's highly, highly compatible with Islamic teachings. Right. By making his very massaged, enriched version of the book, he's able to really show his perspective on it very clearly. So that's going to be one other answer. Yeah, sorry about that circular response. That's what I thought of. Right.
Oh, thank you for the charming talk. Do you know what year the work was translated into Hebrew and under what court patronage at the time?
I can definitely show you that. Let me share my screen real quick. Because if you want to read more versions of Kalilan Dimna, I have this Kalila Reader app that I made. Wow. I'm sure they can circulate a link to it or whatever. And I can go to my info page here. And yeah, Rabbi Joel, dating perhaps to the 12th century CE. And I can't remember where it was that the Hebrew version was supposed to have been translated. But and there's another Hebrew version as well by Yaakov ben Eleazar. There's two medieval Hebrew versions. I think the Rabbi Joel one is the earlier, so that's in the 1100s already. And I just can't remember if it was. I don't want to make a guess statement on where it was that was translated, but I can help you find more information on that. And we have a good edition of that text in a French translation that you can also read here. So if you wanted to read the ascetic and the Liesel in Hebrew with the French translation, you can look at it. So anyway, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question again about the audience, about the intended audience, not the real audience.
Sure.
We have the different copies. Do they state who is their intended audience? Like, is it just directed at the court or like elite, or do they see these as works of ethics that can guide maybe community or more?
Yeah, that's another thing that, and I hate to keep going back to Nasrullah Munshi. His preface is so programmatic and so clear that he's the easiest one to point to. And he does say very specifically that it's not just for rulers, that anyone that has any affairs that they have to manage in life, like if you're managing a farm or a business, could benefit just as well from the kind of ethical lessons that are taught in this. And so that's one thing. Yes, ethically, there is, at least in some versions, this idea that while it might be especially well suited to rulership, it's by no means unique that would apply to rulers. It would also apply to anyone that is like in a position of responsibility, I guess. There's that. There's also even Ibn Muqaffa in the Arabic version, already at that point, there's an interesting part in his preface where he says that the reason that the stories of Kalila and Demna are put through animal characters and put in this kind of entertaining format is so that obviously scholars and learned people will read the fable and understand the message and get it immediately that way. But people who aren't like that or don't have that level of education could be entertained by the story and then kind of accidentally also learn the lesson from it. It would sort of enter their disposition or their temperament, maybe without their even realizing it. So that's another comment on who can benefit from this and why is it that everyone can benefit from it. And then the other thing I wanted to say to that is, and this is funny and kind of ironic, Nasrullah Munshi says that part of the reason he wants to translate from Arabic into Persian, Khalil and Dibna, is because it's difficult for some people to read Arabic books. But then he goes back and puts hundreds of lines of very difficult classical Arabic poetry in the middle of it, which is so hard for people to read that within it's a century later, there's already shuruh, there's glosses that exist just to help people parse the difficult Arabic poetry in Nasrullah's version. So it's a very self-subverting thing that he says. But yeah, definitely there's like I would say almost from the beginning of the Khalil and Dimna textual tradition, there's been repeated authors returning to this idea that it's entertaining so that even people who are not of a scholarly mindset can get the lesson. And it's not only applicable to rulers, it's also possibly for hoi polloi. But yeah, it's one thing to look at what they say about it, and it's another thing to imagine in what contexts the common person would actually been coming into contact with the text. How would they have been receiving it? You know, reading it or performance or who knows? In the Q&A too.
Oh, there we go. Right, sorry, I didn't see that.
Let me type it
Yeah,
in.
so there we go. You want to just type the answer, or do you want to also share it out?
We can share it.
Yeah. Are you responding to the?
I responded to Karen Pinto.
Oh, okay. So there's another question there. Why do you think Khalila and Dibna has been sidelined in favor of the Gulistan and even the Masnavi in the nation-building project of Iran in terms of establishing a text as the quintessential book of ethics, life lessons, etc.?
Geez, that's a good question. And it's hard to answer counterfactually, right? And in fact, I mean, well, I guess we can say that it's been sidelined, right? This is certainly the Gulistan has a higher, more enduring status as the ultimate book of ethics. I guess it's hard to compete with Sa'di. Not only great prose, but great poetry, and it's first-party poetry, unlike Nasrullah's Khalil and Demna, which is it's his prose and then quotes from other people's poetry. It's not. I don't know. The Gulistan is just. It's hard to compete with. That would be what I would say. But also maybe just the length of the journey that Khalila and Demna went through and the number of versions that appeared over the generations could have the effect of obscuring or making it so that there's no one version that you could pin your hat on and say this is the one that we're going to use in the Iranian school system. Although I'm sure that they would use Nasrullah Munshi's version, because there's this other problem, which is that in the late Timurid period, in the late 15th century, there's this new version of Khalil and Dimna in Persian that's written at the Timurid court by Vaiza Kashifi called Anvar Sohaili, which later comes to be viewed as stylistically really not a good text, at least by a lot of more conservative-minded, I mean aesthetically conservative-minded readers of Persian. In 19th century Iran, there's this Bozgashte Adabi movement, this neoclassical return movement that affects both poetry and prose. And there's a real preference for earlier, sort of more spare prose style, not at all the style that's shown in the Anvar Sohaili. So that could also be a problem, that at this time when taste is being made in the 19th century for what are going to be the modern educational institutions, the dominant Persian version of Khalil and Demna at that time was Kashifi's Anvar Sohaili. And it would not have been stylistically desirable. It would not have been what people were looking for at that time. Now, if we reach back further to the 12th century and go for Nasrullah Munshi's version, that's quite appropriate. But again, maybe the multiplicity of versions of Khalil and Dimna, or the ambiguity over which one would be the representative text, could have somehow harmed its status relative to, there's only one Gulistan, right? It's very, very clear what that is. But that's certainly is a good question to think about. I don't have an exact answer.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to the question of the units of world literature, right? Like, do you want which one's better to represent like a tradition, a nation, national literature?
And that's a great point, right? Because Khalil and Dimna doesn't. I mean, does it represent Iran?
Right.
I mean, not uniquely, right? It doesn't belong to anyone. It's animal stories from ancient India. It belongs to everyone and no one. That's something we know about Khalil and Dimna. So that's an even more important point.
Okay. Don't think we have any other questions.
It's more than I expected. Thank you, everyone. It's a lot of questions.
All right. And on that note, thank you, Theo, once again. And thank you again for on our attendees today. Please keep a lookout for our next edition of the Premodern Islamicate World Lectures.